The crystal of the flute clinked against his wedding ring as Jonathan raised it, and he felt a pang of something he quickly drowned in champagne. Beside him, Camille laughed in that way that made his chest swell, her eyes sparkling beneath the monumental chandeliers of the Palais Garnier. She was stunning in the red dress he had personally chosen, the fabric embracing every curve like a fulfilled promise. And that was precisely what that night represented. The promise of a life he had always known he deserved. Paris welcomed him like an old, reconciled lover. The golden lights of the gala hall reflected on the walls adorned with genuine gold leaf, and Jonathan felt he finally belonged. No longer in the suffocating monotony of his Boston office, no longer at the ceremonial dinners with Charlotte and her diplomatic colleagues who treated him as a necessary but uninteresting accessory. Here, beside Camille, he was who he had always wanted to be, a man of the world, refined, desired. Camille touched his arm with that intimate familiarity Charlotte had lost years ago, or perhaps had never had. Charlotte had always been so reserved, so American in her practicality. Even after all her years working in international relations, she never understood the meaning of truly belonging to a place like this. "Mon chéri," Camille whispered, leaning closer, her jasmine perfume enveloping him like a silk curtain. "Minister Dubois is looking over. I told you meeting him would be important." Jonathan straightened his tie, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. Camille had connections Charlotte could never achieve, not with all her diplomatic pomp. Real connections with people who mattered in the Parisian social circle. Through Camille, he had been invited to the annual Arts and Culture Ball, an event so exclusive that even ambassadors struggled to get invitations. "Do you think I should go greet him?" Jonathan asked, suddenly feeling like a teenager seeking approval. Camille laughed, that musical laugh she reserved for when she found something charmingly naive. "Let him come to us, darling. You're with me, aren't you? That's introduction enough." And she was right. As they circulated through the hall, Jonathan noticed the gazes that followed them. Camille greeted acquaintances in fluent French, her voice gliding through the nasal consonants and liquid vowels with the ease of someone born to it. She had grown up in Montmartre, the daughter of a gallery owner and a literature professor at the Sorbonne. She knew Paris the way Jonathan knew Boston's subway routes, every street, every story, every secret. "Camille, ma chérie." An elegant woman with silver hair approached, kissing both cheeks of his companion. They chatted quickly in French, too fast for Jonathan to completely follow, though he caught fragments about an exhibition and someone named Philippe, who had apparently caused a delightful scandal. Jonathan smiled and nodded politely, feeling simultaneously part of that world and an observer of it. But it didn't matter. Being there, with Camille radiant beside him, was worth every moment of linguistic discomfort. "Jonathan, mon amour." Camille turned her attention back to him after the woman walked away. "Madame Rousseau was saying you have exactly the kind of face Monet would have loved to paint. The angles, you know? Very American, but in an interesting way." He knew she was embellishing the conversation, but he didn't care. He liked how Camille made him feel special, desirable, seen. Charlotte had stopped seeing him a long time ago. She was always too busy with her endless meetings, her reports, her work dinners that stretched into the early hours of the morning. When was the last time she had looked at him the way Camille was looking now? The hall began to fill further, and a small orchestra took its place in an elevated corner. The first notes of Debussy floated through the air, and Jonathan felt he was living inside a movie, one of those he used to watch alone in his bachelor apartment, dreaming of a life exactly like this. "Are you happy?" Camille asked, her fingers intertwining with his. "More than I thought possible," he replied, and it was true. In that moment, with the champagne warming his blood and Camille fragrant by his side, Charlotte seemed to belong to a different life, distant, almost unreal. She was in Boston, probably working late again, not even noticing his absence. He had said it was a business conference in London. She barely looked up from her computer when he left. A movement near the main entrance caused a stir in the crowd. Jonathan noticed heads turning, conversations being interrupted. The orchestra continued playing, but something in the air shifted, as if the hall itself held its breath. "What's happening?" Jonathan asked, trying to see past people's backs. Camille stretched gracefully onto her tiptoes, her red dress rippling. "It seems someone important has arrived. Perhaps the new American ambassador. I heard she was making an appearance tonight." Jonathan's stomach twisted into a strange knot, a premonitory feeling he couldn't explain. The American ambassador? Yes, there's quite a story about her. Apparently, she lived in France when she was young, is completely fluent in French, has extraordinary connections in both Washington and Paris. A true cultural bridge, or so they say. Camille took another flute of champagne from a passing tray. The French president personally praised her last week. Quite impressive for an American, don't you think? Jonathan barely heard the last words. His heart began to beat erratically, and he suddenly felt the champagne churn in his stomach. It couldn't be. Charlotte was in Boston. He was certain. She hadn't even mentioned coming to Paris. She would have said something, wouldn't she? But even as he tried to convince himself, a part of him knew. He knew it by the way the crowd parted, reverent. He knew it by the quality of the silence that settled. A silence of genuine admiration. He knew it by the sudden tightness in his chest, as if something precious was about to be irrevocably broken. The crowd parted like curtains opening, and there she was. Charlotte was radiant in a midnight blue dress he had never seen. The kind of dress that probably cost more than their monthly rent. No, his. The apartment was hers, he remembered with a bitter pang. Everything had always been hers, in truth. Her blonde hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon that exposed the graceful line of her neck, where a diamond necklace caught and refracted the light from the chandeliers. She seemed to belong to that place in a way Jonathan never could, no matter how long he spent beside Camille. And she was smiling. Not at him. She hadn't seen him yet. Charlotte smiled at Minister Dubois, who greeted her with the kind of deference Jonathan had dreamed of receiving all night. She replied in French, and even from a distance, Jonathan could hear the perfect, accentless fluency, more natural even than Camille's. "Mon Dieu," Camille whispered beside him. "It's her." Jonathan couldn't reply. He just watched as his wife, the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had convinced himself was too busy to notice him, commanded the entire hall with her mere presence. And for the first time in months, Jonathan felt something beyond self-pity and a desire to escape. He felt fear. Jonathan's body reacted before his mind could fully process the situation. Heat rose up his neck, coloring his cheeks red as he watched Charlotte greet the German ambassador with genuine familiarity, lightly touching his arm as she shared something that made them both laugh. His laughter was genuine, not the forced courtesy Jonathan was used to seeing at diplomatic events. Charlotte had that effect on people, he remembered with a pang of something dangerously close to regret. Camille still held his arm, but now the pressure of her fingers was different. No longer possessive and confident, but hesitant, almost insecure. Jonathan risked a glance her way and saw that she, too, was watching Charlotte, but with an expression he had never seen before. It was as if Camille was calculating something, re-evaluating equations that had once seemed simple. "You know the ambassador." Camille's voice had lost its musical quality, sounding flatter, more cautious. Jonathan opened his mouth, but no sound came out initially. How to explain? How to say that the magnetic woman commanding everyone's attention in the hall was his wife? The same woman he had left in Boston, convinced she was too monotonous, too predictable, too American for this world of European sophistication? He began, but was interrupted. Charlotte had turned slightly, her gaze sweeping the room with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to assessing crowds. For an infinitesimal moment, her eyes met his. Jonathan's stomach plummeted. He expected anger. He expected shock. He expected anything but what he actually saw. Nothing. Charlotte's eyes slid over him as if he were just another unfamiliar face in the crowd, before settling on a group of French dignitaries approaching her with raised glasses. The indifference hurt more than any confrontation would have. "Mesdames et messieurs," the amplified voice of the master of ceremonies echoed through the hall, silencing conversations. "It is with great honor that we welcome this evening Madame Charlotte Whitmore, newly appointed Cultural Ambassador of the United States to France." His last name. She still used his last name. Jonathan didn't know if that made everything better or infinitely worse. Madame Whitmore lived in Lyon during her youth. The master of ceremonies continued in impeccable French, where she developed not only fluency in our language, but a profound understanding of our culture, our history, our soul. She is the author of 3 books on Franco-American cultural relations, an advisor to 2 American presidents on Francophone affairs, and a true adopted daughter of Paris. Every word was like a punch to Jonathan's stomach. How did he not know this? How had he lived with that woman for 5 years and had no idea of the extent of her accomplishments? But he knew the answer, a bitter truth that settled in his throat like ground glass. He had never asked. He had never been interested enough to go beyond superficial conversations about her day, always eagerly waiting for his turn to talk about his own problems, his own frustrations. Charlotte ascended the small stage set up for the welcome speech. Under the lights, she seemed almost ethereal, but there was also a solidity to her, a presence that filled the space in a way Jonathan never could. She began to speak in French, her voice clear and melodious, without notes, without hesitation. "It is an extraordinary honor to be here tonight," she said. And Jonathan realized he understood every word perfectly, even through the fog of panic in his mind. "Paris has always been my second home, the place where I learned that bridges between cultures are not built just with words, but with genuine understanding, mutual respect, and the willingness to see beyond our own limited perspectives." That last sentence seemed directed straight at him, though Charlotte still hadn't looked his way again. Beside him, Camille shifted uncomfortably. "Jonathan, I'm not feeling very well. Perhaps we should." But he barely heard her. He was captivated by the sight of Charlotte gesturing gracefully as she recounted an anecdote about her first visit to the Louvre at 17, when she got lost for 3 hours in the Egyptian galleries and was found by a kind guard who shared his lunch with her while explaining the mythology behind each artifact. The audience laughed at the right moments, sighed at the appropriate ones, completely enchanted. Had she always been like this? Jonathan wondered. Or had he simply never paid enough attention to notice? Memories began to invade his mind, unbidden and uncomfortable. Charlotte trying to share stories about her work during dinner, only to be interrupted by him complaining about his boss. Charlotte suggesting they watch a documentary about French art, and him insisting on a football game. Charlotte casually mentioning she had an important meeting with the State Department, and him just nodding absently while scrolling through his phone. When had he stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her only as an obstacle to the life he thought he deserved? Charlotte concluded her speech with a quote from Victor Hugo about the importance of building bridges instead of walls, and the hall erupted in applause. She descended from the stage with grace, immediately surrounded by a group of people vying for her attention. Minister Dubois, whom Camille had previously pointed out as such an important connection, was now absorbed in conversation with Charlotte, nodding animatedly as he spoke. "We need to go," Camille said again, her voice more insistent now. Her hand tugged at his arm with poorly disguised urgency. Jonathan finally looked at her, truly looked, and saw something he hadn't expected. Camille seemed smaller somehow, less luminous. The red dress that had seemed so stunning half an hour ago now just looked red, just a dress. Her eyes, which he thought so fascinating, avoided his. She was ashamed, he realized, ashamed to be there with a married man, ashamed to be the other woman, ashamed to suddenly be insignificant in a room where she had once felt like a queen. Or perhaps that shame was only his, projected onto her. "Camille, he began, but had no idea how to finish that sentence. Apologies seemed inadequate. Explanations impossible. A new movement in the crowd caught his attention. Charlotte was moving through the hall, stopping to greet groups of people. She spoke Italian with a couple from Milan, German with an industrialist from Frankfurt, and returned to French with the ease of someone changing television channels. In each interaction, she was genuinely engaged, asking questions, laughing at jokes, gently touching arms to emphasize points, and she was approaching them. The icy panic Jonathan had felt before transformed into something warmer, more suffocating. His heart beat so hard he was sure Camille could hear it. Part of him wanted to run, to escape before the inevitable confrontation occurred. But another part, a part he didn't know existed until that moment, wanted to stay. He wanted Charlotte to look at him, truly look, even if it was just to express the anger he deserved. "Jonathan." Camille's voice was urgent now, almost desperate. "She's coming this way. We need to leave now." But it was too late. Charlotte was only a few meters away, conversing with an elderly white-haired lady who wore more jewelry than Jonathan thought physically possible. And then, as if sensing the weight of his gaze, Charlotte turned her head. This time, she didn't look away. Their eyes met across the space that separated them, and Jonathan saw everything in that look. He saw recognition, yes, but also something deeper and more painful. He saw disappointment, but not surprise. He saw sadness, but also something that looked terrifyingly like relief, as if Charlotte had been waiting for this moment, perhaps even wishing for it, so she could finally be allowed to move on. Charlotte tilted her head slightly, a gesture so small that any casual observer wouldn't have noticed. It wasn't a nod of greeting. It was an acknowledgement, a silent full stop to a conversation they had never truly had. And then she turned, offered her arm to the elderly lady, and continued her progression through the hall, leaving Jonathan frozen in place, with a glass of warm champagne in one hand and the wreckage of his arrogance in the other. Camille's hand slipped from Jonathan's arm, and he felt the sudden cold of that empty space, as if he had lost something essential. Around them, the hall continued its celebratory rhythm, champagne flowing, conversations intertwining in multiple languages, the orchestra beginning a Ravel waltz. But, for Jonathan, everything had become distant, blurred, as if he were submerged in murky water while the rest of the world existed in a different dimension. Charlotte had disappeared back into the crowd, absorbed by a circle of admirers competing for her attention. He could occasionally catch glimpses of that midnight blue dress moving gracefully among the groups, always at the center, always radiant. Like a star in her own solar system, he thought bitterly, while he had become just another piece of debris floating in the darkness. "You lied to me." Camille's voice cut through his thoughts. It wasn't a shouted accusation, but a flat statement, devoid of the music that usually characterized her speech. "You said your wife was a boring bureaucrat in Boston. You said she barely spoke French, that she didn't understand Europe, that she was monotonous," Jonathan completed, the word coming out like ash in his mouth. "I said she was monotonous." Camille gave a short, humorless laugh. "The most fascinating woman in this hall. The person everyone wants to meet, everyone wants to talk to. Is that your monotonous wife?" Jonathan finally looked directly at her. Beneath the carefully applied makeup, he could see lines of tension around Camille's eyes. She looked older suddenly, or perhaps he was just seeing her clearly for the first time. Camille was beautiful, yes, sophisticated, yes, but there was a hardness in her features he had never noticed before. A calculating coldness that had always been there, he realized. He had just chosen not to see. "I didn't know," he said, and it sounded pathetic even to his own ears. "I didn't know she was like this." "Or you never paid enough attention to find out." Camille adjusted the strap of her red dress with fingers that trembled slightly. "You know what I think, Jonathan? I think you knew exactly who she was. You just needed to believe she was less than you to justify what you were doing." The truth of those words hit him like a physical blow. Jonathan felt his knees buckle, and he had to steady himself against a nearby ornate column to keep his balance. The cold surface of the marble against his palm was the only thing that felt real in that moment. "Camille, No." She raised her hand, stopping him. "You don't need to say anything. I also lied to myself, didn't I? I said you were special. That we were special. But looking at her, looking at the way you look at her even now, even after everything." Camille shook her head, and Jonathan saw something that looked dangerously like pity in her eyes. "You never looked at me like that." "What are you talking about?" "What way?" "As if she were the sun, and you finally understood you'd been living in darkness your whole life." Before Jonathan could reply, before he could process that observation, a tall man in an impeccable suit approached. He had that casual confidence that came with old money and an education at the best European schools. His eyes slid over Jonathan with disinterest before settling on Camille. "Camille, ma belle," he said, kissing both her cheeks. "Long time no see. I heard you're working at your father's gallery now?" Jonathan watched, unseen, as Camille transformed instantly, that luminosity returning to her face, like a carefully placed mask. She chatted with the man in rapid French, laughing at appropriate moments, touching his arm with studied familiarity. And Jonathan understood, with a clarity that stung, that he was replaceable. He always had been. To Camille, he was just another bored married man looking for validation, and she had played the role he needed because it was convenient, because it was fun, because Paris was full of men just like him. He drifted away without Camille noticing, or perhaps she noticed and simply didn't care. The distinction seemed irrelevant now. Jonathan wandered the perimeter of the hall, keeping to the shadows between the columns, avoiding the center where Charlotte still shone brightly. He picked up another glass of champagne, though the drink no longer had taste, just a bitter acidity that matched the knot in his stomach. A nearby group was conversing in English, and Jonathan involuntarily tuned into their conversation. "Ambassador Whitmore is extraordinary, isn't she?" an emerald-clad woman was saying. "I heard her speak at the Musée d'Orsay event last month. Absolutely brilliant in her analysis of Impressionist influence on contemporary American culture." "And so humble," added her companion, an older man with a distinct British accent. "She spent 20 minutes chatting with me about my research on Monet, asking genuinely insightful questions. You can tell she truly cares, that it's not just superficial diplomacy." "I heard she's writing a 4th book," the woman continued, "about the American expatriate experience in Paris during the interwar period. Apparently, she discovered unpublished correspondence from Gertrude Stein in an archive in Lyon." Every word was another layer of revelation, another indicator of how completely Jonathan had failed to know the woman with whom he shared a life. Charlotte wasn't just competent at her job. She was exceptional, recognized, respected. And he had reduced all of it to boring office work in his mind, because it was easier than acknowledging that she had built something significant while he was stuck in self-imposed mediocrity. A sudden movement near the main entrance drew everyone's attention. A tall, distinguished man had arrived, accompanied by discreet bodyguards. The buzz immediately intensified. "It's the Prime Minister," someone whispered reverently. "He rarely attends social events." Jonathan watched, stupefied, as the Prime Minister swept the hall with his eyes before fixing them directly on Charlotte. A genuine smile lit up his usually serious face, and he walked directly toward her, ignoring the other dignitaries who tried to catch his attention. Charlotte turned when someone touched her shoulder, and her face lit up with genuine pleasure. She and the Prime Minister greeted each other like old friends, not with the formality their respective positions would normally demand. They chatted animatedly in French, and Jonathan could see Charlotte gesturing expressively as she told some story that made the most powerful man in France laugh openly. They met when she was researching her 2nd book, a voice said beside Jonathan. He turned to find an elderly lady, the same one Charlotte had escorted through the hall earlier. Her eyes were sharp and perceptive, assessing him with a precision that made him want to shrink. Monsieur Beaumont was just a provincial senator at the time. Charlotte interviewed him about cultural initiatives in Lyon, and they had kept in touch ever since. When he became Prime Minister, she was one of the first people he called upon for consultancy on how to strengthen Franco-American cultural ties. "I didn't know," Jonathan murmured, because there was nothing else to say. "Of course you didn't," the lady said, not cruelly, but with a frankness that somehow hurt more. "Men like you rarely know. You're so busy building narratives about how your wives disappoint you that you never stop to see who they truly are." Jonathan stared at her. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me." The lady gave a small, sad smile. "Dear boy, I know your type exactly. My own husband was one of you, many years ago. He also had his Camille's, his excuses, his justifications, and he also had that moment, in a hall not so different from this one, when he finally saw what he had discarded." She paused, her eyes fixing on Charlotte and the Prime Minister. "The difference is, he realized in time to make amends. I have a feeling you won't be so lucky." Before Jonathan could reply, the orchestra swelled, signaling that the formal dance was about to begin. The Prime Minister extended his hand to Charlotte with a graceful smile, inviting her to the opening waltz. It was an extraordinary honor, Jonathan vaguely understood, the kind of recognition people spent entire careers hoping to receive. Charlotte accepted with grace, placing her hand in his, and they glided to the center of the dance floor. Other couples quickly joined, but there was a respectful circle of space around Charlotte and the Prime Minister, acknowledging them as the stars of that particular performance. Jonathan couldn't tear his eyes away. Charlotte moved as if she had been born to it, each step perfectly synchronized with the music and with her partner. The midnight blue dress swirled around her legs, catching the light in ways that made the fabric seem alive. She was smiling, not the polite, tired smile Jonathan had grown accustomed to seeing at home, but something genuine and radiant. It was like watching a version of her from a parallel universe, he thought. Or perhaps this had always been the real version, and what he had seen at home was just a shadow, the part of her that remained after she saved all her light for the world that truly appreciated her. The waltz continued, and more couples filled the floor. Jonathan saw Camille dancing with the man who had approached her earlier, her head thrown back in performative laughter. He felt nothing at seeing her. All the passion he thought he had felt, all the desire that had brought him to Paris, had evaporated like mist under the relentless sun of reality. When the music finally ended, the hall erupted in applause. The Prime Minister kissed Charlotte's hand with old-fashioned gallantry before escorting her back to the circle of eagerly waiting dignitaries. And throughout, Charlotte didn't once look in Jonathan's direction. He was beginning to understand that this was intentional, not because she hadn't seen him, but because she had decided he no longer deserved her attention. He had become irrelevant in her narrative, a footnote she was prepared to edit out completely. The elderly lady touched his arm gently. "There's a side exit there," she said, subtly pointing to a door hidden behind an elaborate tapestry. "If you want to leave this place with a shred of dignity left, I suggest you use it. Soon, everyone will know exactly who you are and what you've done. Paris loves a scandal, but rarely has sympathy for its protagonists." Jonathan looked at Charlotte one last time. She was surrounded by light and admiration, living a life he never imagined she had, reaching heights he hadn't even dreamed for himself. And he, finally, understood the full extent of his mistake. Without another word, Jonathan walked toward the side door, leaving behind the warmth and light of the gala hall, disappearing into the cold shadows of the Palais Garnier's service corridors. The cold air of the service corridor hit Jonathan like a physical slap. He staggered slightly, leaning against the damp stone wall as his eyes adjusted to the gloom. Behind him, the heavy doors muffled the sounds of the gala hall, reducing the music and laughter to a distant, ghostly murmur. It was as if he had crossed into another world, a world of shadows and silence where men like him belonged. Jonathan pulled his phone from his pocket with trembling fingers. 3 unread messages from Camille. He deleted them unread. It no longer mattered what she had to say. All that fantasy had disintegrated the moment Charlotte walked into that ballroom, and now he was left with only the sharp fragments of reality. Should he call her? Jonathan's thumb hovered over Charlotte's name in his contacts, that old profile picture of her smiling on a beach during a vacation they took in their early years of marriage. When was the last time he made her smile like that? When was the last time he really tried? The phone vibrated in his hand, and Jonathan's heart leaped for an irrational moment of hope that it was Charlotte. But it was just his boss in Boston, probably asking about the fabricated business conference. Jonathan ended the call and blacked out the screen, plunging the hallway back into gloom. His legs carried him to a side staircase that spiraled downwards. Jonathan followed it blindly, a hand on the cold wall for balance, descending deeper and deeper into the bowels of the historic building. He could hear the muffled sound of machinery somewhere below, the constant hum of modern systems hidden within this 19th century relic. When he finally emerged into another corridor, this one wider and better lit, Jonathan realized he had reached an administrative area. Office doors lined both sides, all closed and dark at this late hour. He kept walking until he found a small waiting area with benches upholstered in worn red velvet. Without thinking, he collapsed onto one of them, letting his head fall into his hands. The silence here was absolute, almost oppressive. Jonathan could hear his own breathing, rapid and uneven, and his accelerated pulse hammering in his ears. How long had he been sitting there? Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to have lost all meaning. Images of the gala ballroom kept flashing through his mind like slides in a cruel presentation. Charlotte, dancing with the Prime Minister. Charlotte surrounded by admirers. Charlotte speaking that perfect, effortless French. Charlotte being everything he had insisted she was not. And Camille? He could barely remember her face now. All that burning desire that had consumed him for months had cooled to ashes. What had he seen in her? Validation, he realized bitterly. A beautiful French woman who made him feel special, sophisticated, desirable. She was a mirror reflecting the image he wanted to see of himself, not who he truly was, but Charlotte. Charlotte was a mirror showing the truth he had desperately tried to avoid. That he was mediocre, that he was lazy in his relationships, lazy in his ambitions, lazy in his personal growth. That he had married an extraordinary woman and spent 5 years trying to convince her, and himself, that she was ordinary because confronting his own mediocrity was too painful. The sound of footsteps echoing in the corridor made Jonathan raise his head sharply. A figure emerged from the darkness, and for a moment his heart raced with the impossible possibility that Charlotte had come looking for him. But it was just an elderly security guard doing his rounds, his flashlight sweeping the corridor with practical movements. The man stopped when he saw Jonathan. "Monsieur, cette zone est interdite au public." Jonathan blinked, processing the French words slowly. "Sorry, I got lost. From the gala ballroom. Needed some fresh air." The security guard studied him for a moment, and Jonathan saw assessment in those tired eyes. Finally, the man nodded. "La sortie est par là," he said, pointing back in the direction Jonathan had come from. "Vous pouvez retourner à la fête, où il y a une sortie vers la rue. Go back to the party or leave for the street." As if it were a simple choice. As if a decision about doors could somehow solve the chaos his life had become. "Merci," Jonathan murmured, forcing himself to his feet. His legs were stiff from sitting in the same position, and he swayed slightly. The security guard extended a hand to steady him, a gesture of kindness that made something clench painfully in Jonathan's chest. "Ça va, monsieur?" the man asked, genuinely concerned now. "No," Jonathan said honestly, the word escaping before he could censor it. "No, I'm not well." The security guard nodded slowly, as if this was an answer he heard frequently within these old walls. "L'amour?" he asked simply. Jonathan gave a harsh, humorless laugh. "How did you know?" A Gallic shrug. "C'est toujours l'amour, ou l'argent, mais surtout l'amour." Then, in heavily accented English, "is always love. Make men do stupid things." "I've done a lot of stupid things," Jonathan admitted, and it was a relief to say it aloud, to confess to this kind stranger in an empty corridor. So many stupid things. The security guard patted his shoulder with a calloused hand. "Alors, vous arrêtez de faire des choses stupides. You stop. You fix. Or you don't fix, and you learn." He gestured vaguely towards the stairs. "Mais d'abord, vous sortez d'ici. This place, It is for celebration. You need real air, not party air. Jonathan found himself nodding, accepting this unexpected wisdom. Where is the exit to the street? The security guard pointed to a side corridor. Tout droit, puis à gauche. It will lead to Rue Crave. There is a café there, still open. Café Claude. Good for thinking. Thank you, Jonathan said. And this time, it carried real weight. For everything. Zeituns, the man merely waved his flashlight, already returning to his rounds, and Jonathan followed the given directions. The corridor led him through more administrative areas, then past a storage area filled with stacked chairs and rolled-up backdrops, finally ending at a heavy metal door marked as an emergency exit. Jonathan pushed it open and stepped out into the Parisian night. The air was cold and damp, carrying the promise of rain. Rue Scribe was quiet at this hour, only a few pedestrians hurrying past, wrapped in coats and scarves. Streetlights cast yellow puddles on the wet pavement, and somewhere nearby, Jonathan could hear the distant sound of traffic and a faraway siren. He stood in the street for a long moment, just breathing, feeling the reality of the cold world around him. There was no glamour here, no illusion, just Paris being Paris, a real city full of real people living real lives, not the fantasy playground he had built in his imagination. The café the security guard had mentioned was across the street, its warm light spilling through misty windows. Café Claude, the sign read discreetly. Jonathan crossed towards it, his legs moving on autopilot, needing some destination, any destination that wasn't back to that gala ballroom. Inside, the café was small and comfortably worn, with mismatched chairs and tables scarred by decades of use. Only a few customers dotted the space, most of them solitary, engrossed in books or laptops or their own thoughts. An elderly waiter in a stained apron looked up as Jonathan entered, nodding towards an empty table near the window. Jonathan sank into the chair and ordered coffee without really thinking about it. The waiter returned moments later with a dark, bitter espresso and a small glass of water. Jonathan drank the coffee in one gulp, welcoming the burn in his throat, something physical to focus on besides the turmoil in his mind. Through the window, he could see the Palais Garnier in the distance, its elaborate facades lit up against the night sky. Charlotte was still inside, still shining, still being extraordinary. And he was here, alone in a shabby café, finally forced to confront who he truly was when all illusions were stripped away. His phone vibrated again. This time, it was a message from Charlotte. Jonathan's heart stopped as he opened it, his hands trembling so much he almost dropped the device. The message was short, just 3 words in perfect French. Je sais tout. I know everything. Jonathan stared at those words until they blurred, and then came the second message. My lawyer will contact you tomorrow. Do not return to our apartment. Your belongings will be in storage. Our apartment. Except it had never been theirs, had it? It had always been hers. Everything had always been hers. He had merely existed in her orbit, warming himself in her light while contributing nothing but complaints and resentment. A third message. I should be angry. I should be hurt. But mostly, Jonathan, I'm relieved. You set me free. Jonathan let the phone fall onto the table as if it had burned his hand. He had freed her. He hadn't betrayed her, he realized with sudden, brutal clarity. He had freed her from a relationship that was holding her back, from a partner who never saw her, never appreciated her, never tried to measure up to her. The waiter appeared again, refilling his glass of water unprompted. Jonathan looked up and saw understanding in those ancient eyes. How many shattered souls had this man served over the years? How many broken hearts had found refuge in these worn chairs? "Another coffee?" the waiter asked in accented English. Jonathan shook his head. "No, just— Can I stay here for a while?" "Tant que vous en avez besoin, monsieur. As long as you need. Dig." And so Jonathan sat as Paris continued its nightlife around him, a man alone in a cafe, finally, painfully, beginning to understand the full weight of what he had lost and the insignificant man he had allowed himself to become. The coffee cup grew cold between Jonathan's fingers as he remained seated in the uncomfortable chair at Café Claude, watching his blurred reflection in the misty window. On the other side of the glass, Paris continued its nocturnal dance of lights and shadows, indifferent to the silent collapse happening within him. Charlotte's messages glowed on the phone screen like luminous accusations, each word a sentence he couldn't dispute, because he knew they were true. The waiter passed by again, this time bringing a small plate with a slice of almond cake that Jonathan hadn't ordered. The man simply waved when Jonathan started to protest, mumbling something in French about gratuitous kindnesses before disappearing back behind the counter. It was a simple gesture of humanity that made Jonathan's throat tighten uncomfortably. How long had it been since he had done something kind for Charlotte without expecting anything in return? The answer came quickly and brutally. Years, perhaps since the beginning, when he was still trying to impress her, when marriage was new and he still needed to prove his worth. But when she became his, when the ring was on her finger and the formalities concluded, he simply stopped trying. He assumed Charlotte would always be there, a constant, reliable presence, like furniture or running water. Jonathan bit into the cake mechanically, without truly tasting it. His hands were numb, his entire body seemed to be operating through a thick fog. Through the window, he could see couples passing arm in arm, tourists laughing as they took selfies in front of the illuminated monuments. The normal life of Paris on a normal night. Except that nothing about that night was normal, and Jonathan suspected that nothing would ever be normal again. Another couple entered the cafe, young and clearly in love, the kind of new, bright love that hadn't yet been tested by time or boredom. They sat in a corner, so absorbed in each other that the rest of the world could have vanished. Jonathan watched how the young man hung on the girl's every word, how she touched his arm as she spoke, how they shared secret smiles that needed no translation. He and Charlotte were like that once? There must have been a time, early on, when he truly listened to her, when her stories were fascinating instead of inconvenient interruptions to his own complaints. Trying to remember, Jonathan managed to retrieve fragments of memories from those early months. Charlotte speaking excitedly about a discovery she had made in French archives for her first book. He, feigning interest while secretly checking sports scores on his phone under the table. Charlotte inviting him to a museum lecture on French Impressionism. He declining because there was an important game that night. Each memory was like a knife, revealing a pattern he had refused to see. It wasn't Charlotte who changed. It was he who had never truly tried. The phone vibrated again, and Jonathan picked it up with reluctant fingers, expecting another devastating message from Charlotte. But it was Camille this time. A long sequence of texts in French that he had to put through the phone's translator to fully understand. "I should have realized," the first message read, "the way you talked about her, always with that tone of resentment, but also something more. You were obsessed with her, Jonathan, just not in the way you thought." The next was more direct. "You used me as a mirror to see a version of yourself that doesn't exist. And I let you, because it was convenient to have someone who adored me without truly knowing me. We are both guilty of living in fantasies." The final message surprised him with its raw sincerity. "I hope you find a way to forgive yourself eventually. But first, you need to stop hiding from the man you really are. Good luck, Jonathan. You're going to need it. Jonathan deleted the messages and placed the phone face down on the table, as if not seeing the screen could somehow erase the truths that kept coming from all sides. The cafe was quieter now, only the low murmur of conversations and the occasional clinking of crockery. Someone had put on soft music, an old French song he didn't recognize, but which somehow conveyed all the melancholy he felt. He should be planning his next steps, Jonathan knew. Find a hotel since he couldn't return to the apartment. Call his boss and confess there was no business conference. Begin the painful process of dismantling the life he had built with Charlotte, or more precisely, the life she had built while he merely existed beside her. But all he could do was sit there, paralyzed by the magnitude of his own stupidity. How many clues had he ignored? Charlotte working late not because she was a workaholic, but because she was building something meaningful. Her frequent travels were not about selfish ambition, but about weaving genuine connections between cultures. Her perfect French wasn't for show. It was the result of years of living and loving France in a way Jonathan had only pretended to do for a few weeks with Camille. The young couple in the corner was leaving now, still entwined with each other, and Jonathan felt a sharp pang of envy. Not for their youth or their new love, but for the sincerity. They hadn't yet learned to disappoint each other, hadn't yet built the walls of resentment and excuses that Jonathan had so carefully erected around himself. A familiar figure appeared outside the cafe window, and Jonathan's heart leaped before he realized it wasn't Charlotte, just another blonde woman in an elegant dress, probably returning from some event. But that brief moment of panic revealed something he wasn't ready to admit. Part of him still hoped Charlotte would come looking for him, that there would be some dramatic scene of reconciliation where he could apologize, and she would forgive, and everything would go back to normal. Except that nothing would go back to normal, and he didn't deserve her forgiveness. Her messages had made that crystal clear. She wasn't hurt or angry. She was relieved. Relieved to be free of him, free from the diminished version of herself she had to be to make his fragile ego feel less threatened. Jonathan pulled a crumpled note from his pocket and left it on the table. Much more than the coffee and cake cost, but he didn't care. He needed to move, to do something, even if it was just to wander the streets until he found a hotel that would accept a disoriented man without a reservation in the middle of the night. Outside, the air was colder now, with a biting wind that made Jonathan pull his coat tighter. He started walking with no real direction, letting his feet choose the path while his mind spun in tighter and tighter circles. The city was quieter now, most of the tourists and revelers having already retired. Only a few solitary figures remained on the streets, shadowy figures with their own tales of regret and loss. He passed a storefront that reflected his image, and Jonathan stopped, forcing himself to really look. The man looking back seemed like a worn-out version of himself. Tie askew, hair disheveled, empty eyes that didn't quite recognize him. When had he become this stranger? Or had he always been like this and simply refused to see? A sudden memory hit him with unexpected force. 3 years ago, Charlotte receiving news that her second book had won a prestigious award. She had come home radiant, holding the printed email in trembling hands, wanting to celebrate. And Jonathan, what had he done? Murmured distracted congratulations before returning his attention to the basketball game on television. When she tried to share details about the award, he complained about being tired of hearing about work. He saw her face fall at that moment, saw the light go out in her eyes, but didn't care enough to fix it. He just assumed she was being dramatic, that she needed to learn to read the room better. It never occurred to him that he was the problem, that his consistent disinterest in her achievements was slowly killing something precious between them. How many moments like that had there been? How many times had Charlotte tried to reach out to him, tried to share her life with him, only to be met with indifference or poorly disguised resentment? And at some point, she stopped trying, built a full and rich life separate from him, a life where she was valued and appreciated and seen. Jonathan found himself in front of another hotel, this one more modest than the grand palaces near the opera. The sign read, Hôtel Beau Séjour, and through the windows he could see a small but clean reception area, with an elderly lady reading a book behind the counter. It seemed like the kind of place that would ask minimal questions, that would accept a lost man in the middle of the night without judgment. He pushed the door open, and a soft chime announced his entry. The lady looked up, assessing him quickly, before motioning for him to approach. Jonathan approached the counter, suddenly aware of how disheveled and desperate he must look. Bonsoir, she said calmly. Vous cherchez une chambre? Yes, Jonathan replied in English, too tired to attempt French. A room, for one night. Maybe more. I'm not sure yet. The lady nodded, as if she regularly received uncertain guests. 45 euros, petit déjeuner inclus. Seeing his confused expression, she switched to broken English. 45 euros, breakfast included. Jonathan handed over his credit card, and she processed the transaction with quiet efficiency before handing him a real metal key, not an electronic key card. Something about the solidity of that cold metal in his palm was comforting. 12e étage, she said, pointing to a narrow staircase. 2nd floor. Bathroom is shared, but you are the only guest tonight, so you will have privacy. Jonathan thanked her and climbed the creaking steps to the 2nd floor. The corridor was narrow and slightly sloping, the kind of crooked charm that came with centuries-old buildings. He found his room, number 7, and unlocked the door to reveal a small but surprisingly cozy space. A narrow bed covered with a clean white duvet, a wooden chair, a tiny window overlooking a dark courtyard. He dropped onto the bed without bothering to take off his shoes, staring at the cracked ceiling above him. Somewhere on the other side of Paris, Charlotte was probably still at her gala ball, still shining, still being extraordinary. And here he was, alone in a 45-euro hotel room, finally confronting the emptiness where a better man should have been. The phone vibrated one last time. Jonathan almost didn't check, but something made him pull the device from his pocket. It wasn't Charlotte or Camille this time, but an automated email confirming his credit card being charged for the removal of his belongings from the apartment and their transfer to storage. Efficient to the very end, Charlotte was already erasing his presence from her life. Jonathan let the phone fall to the floor and closed his eyes, wishing for the oblivion of sleep, but knowing it wouldn't come easily. Tomorrow he would have to face the practical consequences of his choices. But tonight, all he could do was lie in the darkness and finally, painfully, begin to understand the full cost of never having truly seen the extraordinary woman he had been privileged enough to call his wife. The gray morning light filtered through the tiny window when Jonathan finally gave up trying to sleep. His back ached from the narrow bed, his eyes burned from exhaustion and unshed tears, and his mind kept replaying scenes from the gala ball in an endless, punishing loop. He dragged himself to the small sink in the corner of the room and splashed cold water on his face, observing his reflection in the stained mirror. The man looking back seemed to have aged a decade overnight. The phone showed 7:15 in the morning. Messages from his boss piled up on the screen, each more insistent than the last, demanding explanations about his whereabouts and why there were no reports from the fabricated conference. Jonathan deleted them all without fully reading. That job, like so many other things in his life, suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of the magnitude of what he had lost. He descended the creaking stairs to the small breakfast room where the receptionist lady had set up a modest table with bread, jams, fresh coffee, and orange juice. Only one other guest was present, a Japanese businessman absorbed in his laptop, and Jonathan silently thanked him for the lack of need for conversation. He took a croissant he had no appetite for, and a cup of coffee, which he drank mechanically, feeling the caffeine do little to dissipate the fog in his mind. Would Charlotte be awake now? Probably not, after a night at the gala ball. She had always been able to function on little sleep when necessary, yet another of her many practical qualities that Jonathan had interpreted as emotional coldness. How many other admirable traits had he distorted into imaginary flaws to justify his own discontent? The spilled coffee on the table formed a small brown puddle that he watched slowly expand, unable to gather the energy to wipe it. His hands trembled slightly, a combination of caffeine and residual adrenaline from the previous night's shock. He needed to make a plan, decide his next steps, but each time he tried to organize his thoughts, they slipped away like sand between his fingers. His phone vibrated with a new message. This time it was from an unknown number with a Boston area code. Jonathan opened it with reluctant fingers. "Mr. Whitmore, I am Daniel Rousseau, an attorney representing Charlotte Whitmore in matters of marital dissolution. My client has requested that I contact you to discuss the terms of the separation. Please call me at the number below when you are able to speak. I appreciate your cooperation in this matter." The formality of the words was like ground glass. Marital dissolution. As if 5 years of marriage could be reduced to legal terminology and processed paperwork. But that was exactly what he had reduced it to when he decided to bring Camille to Paris, wasn't it? He had turned a relationship into something disposable, replaceable. Jonathan copied the lawyer's number, but didn't call immediately. First, he needed to think. He needed to understand what he really wanted. Not what his wounded pride wanted, not what his fantasy of a glamorous life promised, but what he genuinely, honestly desired for the rest of his life. The answer came faster than he expected, crystal clear in its painful clarity. He wanted Charlotte. Not the diminished version of her he had created in his mind to feel superior, but the real, extraordinary woman who had shone at the gala ball. He wanted the chance to truly know her, to ask the questions he never asked, to hear the stories he always interrupted. He wanted to be the kind of man who deserved to be by her side, not as an accessory or a dead weight, but as a genuine partner. But wanting something and deserving it were completely different things. And Charlotte's messages had made it clear that she wasn't looking for reconciliation. She was relieved to be free of him, and Jonathan couldn't blame her. What reason would she have to give another chance to a man who had spent 5 years proving he didn't value her? The receptionist lady appeared at the entrance to the room with a cloth to wipe the tables. She noticed the spilled coffee and made a soft sound of sympathy before cleaning it efficiently. Jonathan murmured an apology, but she just shook her head. "Ça arrive," she said gently. "It happens." Then, with that strange intuition some people seem to have for detecting suffering. "Problèmes de cœur?" Jonathan nodded, unable to trust his voice for a moment. The unexpected kindness of this stranger was threatening to break the fragile control he held over his emotions. "L'amour est compliqué," she continued, cleaning the table around him with smooth, practical movements. "But you are still young. There is time to fix mistakes, or to learn from them and do better next time." Next time. As if there could be a next time. as if Charlotte was something that could be replaced by someone else in the future. The idea was simultaneously comforting and profoundly wrong. Jonathan didn't want a next time with someone else. He wanted to make it right this time, with the only person who mattered. But some things, once broken, could not be fixed. Some betrayals were too final, some damage too irreversible. He had crossed that line when he took Camille to Paris, when he flaunted his infidelity at the most important event of Charlotte's career, when he actively chose to humiliate her even without knowing she would be there to witness it. Jonathan finished his coffee and returned to his room, each step seeming to require monumental effort. The bed was still unmade from his sleepless night, and he briefly considered just throwing himself back into it and giving up on everything. But that would just be another escape, another cowardly choice in a life that had become defined by them. He picked up the phone and dialed Charlotte's lawyer's number before he could change his mind. The call was answered on the second ring. "Daniel Rousseau." "It's Jonathan Whitmore," he said, his voice sounding hoarse and tired. "I received your message." There was a brief pause, the sound of papers being shuffled. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for returning my call so promptly. I imagine this is a difficult situation for all involved." The professional formality was almost comforting in its impersonality. Jonathan clung to it like a lifeline. What does Charlotte want? "My client is seeking a quick and amicable dissolution of the marriage," Rousseau explained calmly. "She is not interested in prolonging the process or creating unnecessary difficulties, given that most of the assets are in her name, including the apartment in Boston. She is prepared to be generous in terms of settlement." Generous? Of course she would be. Even at the end of everything, Charlotte was being kinder to him than he deserved. "I don't want anything from her," Jonathan said, the words coming out before he could fully think them through. "None of the assets, none of the money. That's not why I married her, and I won't accept guilt payments in the divorce." There was another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Whitmore, I understand you are emotionally affected, but I would advise against hasty financial decisions. You are legally entitled to—" "I don't want what I'm legally entitled to," Jonathan interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "I want you to tell Charlotte that I accept whatever terms she wants. She can have everything. I only have one request." "What would that be?" Jonathan took a deep breath, steeling himself for the only thing that truly mattered. "I want a chance to apologize to her in person, not to try to change her decision or beg for another chance, just to look her in the eyes and tell her I'm sorry for the man I was and for all the years I wasted without truly seeing her." The lawyer was silent for a long moment. "I will convey your request to my client, but I cannot promise she will agree to meet you. She has been very clear about wanting to move on." "I know," Jonathan said calmly, "but I need to ask. If she says no, I will accept that too. I will sign whatever is necessary, whenever it's necessary, without contesting anything." "I understand. I will contact you after speaking with Ms. Whitmore. In the meantime, if you could provide me with an address in Paris where documents can be sent." Jonathan provided the address of the Hotel Beau Séjour, acutely aware of how pathetic it sounded to be in a €45 a night hotel, while his wife was likely in a luxurious suite somewhere. But there was something honest about it, too. A fitting match between his external circumstances and his internal reality. After the call ended, Jonathan sat on the edge of the bed and simply breathed. For the first time since he'd seen Charlotte at the gala, he felt something other than panic and despair. It wasn't hope exactly, for he had no illusions about reconciliation, But it was something close to clarity, a realization that he needed to accept the consequences of his choices without trying to negotiate or escape them. His phone rang again, this time a call from his boss. Jonathan answered, ready to face yet another consequence. "Where the hell are you, Whitmore?" The voice was tight, with poorly controlled anger. "You've missed 3 important meetings. There's no record of any conference in London. And now I find out you used the company credit card for airfare to Paris?" "I lied about the conference," Jonathan said simply, too tired to fabricate more excuses. "I came to Paris for personal reasons. I understand if you want to fire me." The line went silent for a moment of shock. "Are you telling me you fabricated a business trip and used company funds to finance a personal getaway?" "Yes, and I'll pay back all the money. Every penny. You can deduct it from my final paycheck if necessary." Another long pause. "Whitmore, I don't know what's going on with you, but this is unacceptable. When you get back to Boston, we'll have a serious conversation about your future at this company. In fact, don't even bother coming back to the office. You're suspended without pay until further notice. You'll receive an email regarding the next steps." The call ended, and Jonathan set his phone aside. He should have felt panic at the imminent loss of his job, worry about how he'd pay rent and bills, but all he felt was a strange sense of relief. Another cord cut, another piece of the old life falling away. He stood up and walked to the tiny window, looking down at the small, surprisingly charming courtyard below. An old tree grew in the center, its leaves starting to show the first signs of yellowing from the approaching autumn. An orange cat was curled up on a stone bench, soaking in the weak morning sun. Jonathan stood there for a long time, watching that simple scene, letting his mind finally slow down from the frantic panic that had dominated it since the night before. Paris continued its life outside, indifferent to his personal dramas. The world hadn't stopped because his marriage was over, because he had lost everything he thought mattered. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was something liberating in that. Without a job to hide behind, without Charlotte to blame for his own inadequacies, without Camille to validate his fantasy of being someone he wasn't, Jonathan was finally alone with himself. And the man he found in that morning reflection wasn't who he'd imagined himself to be, but he could become someone better. Not to win Charlotte back, because that ship had sailed and sunk, but for himself, so that the next chapter of his life would be written by someone who at least tried to be honest about his flaws and worked to correct them. The phone vibrated with a final message from the lawyer. Jonathan read it with hands that no longer trembled. "My client has agreed to meet you tomorrow at 3 p.m. at the Jardin du Luxembourg. She asks that you respect the fact that this will be a final and brief encounter. Please confirm if this time works for you." Jonathan typed his confirmation and sent it. Tomorrow, then. One last chance to look Charlotte in the eyes and say the words he should have said every day for the past 5 years. It wouldn't change anything, wouldn't undo the damage, but it was all he had left to offer. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the beginning of learning to be the kind of man who could look at his own reflection without shame. The Jardin du Luxembourg was quiet for a September afternoon. Just a few scattered tourists photographing the statues and children chasing pigeons around the central fountain. Jonathan arrived 15 minutes early, finding a bench with a view of the main path where Charlotte would inevitably pass. His hands were sweating in his pockets, and he wiped them repeatedly on the fabric of the jeans he'd bought that morning from a modest shop near the hotel. The suit he'd worn to the gala was too crumpled to be saved, another fitting metaphor for the state of his life. He had spent the previous night rehearsing what he would say, mentally writing and rewriting every word until it all sounded hollow and insufficient. How to summarize 5 years of failures in a brief conversation. How to express remorse deep enough to match the magnitude of what he had destroyed. Words seemed inadequate tools for the impossible task before him. 3 o'clock arrived and passed. Jonathan watched the clock on his phone compulsively, each additional minute making his stomach tighten further. Perhaps she had changed her mind. Perhaps she realized that even this gesture of closure wasn't worth her time. He couldn't blame her. But then, at 3:12, he saw her. Charlotte walked along the gravel path with that elegant posture he'd always noticed but never truly appreciated, wearing a simple light blue pantsuit that somehow made her seem more real than the dazzling vision at the gala. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, moving softly with each step, and she wore sunglasses that hid her eyes. Jonathan stood as she approached, his legs suddenly unsteady beneath him. Charlotte stopped a few feet away, maintaining that respectful distance that said everything about where they now stood. She did not remove her sunglasses. "Charlotte," he began, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me. I didn't expect you to." "I almost didn't come," she interrupted him, her voice calm but firm. "But Daniel said you weren't asking for anything except this. And I thought perhaps we both needed closure." Jonathan nodded, accepting her brutal honesty. "I rehearsed what I wanted to say all night, but now it all feels inadequate. How do you apologize for 5 years of failures?" Charlotte finally removed her sunglasses, and Jonathan saw that her eyes were tired but dry. There were no tears, no violent emotion he could interpret as hope or anger. Just a calm, resolved sadness. "You don't need to summarize 5 years, Jonathan. I lived every day of them. I know exactly what happened, and when I stopped mattering to you—" "You always mattered," he protested, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "No," Charlotte gently corrected, shaking her head. "I mattered in the beginning, when you were still trying to impress. But at some point I became just part of the scenery of your life, something you expected to be there but never truly saw, and eventually you started to resent me for not being the fantasy you had built in your head." The precision of her words cut more deeply than any shouted accusation would have. Jonathan sank heavily back onto the bench, and after a moment of hesitation, Charlotte joined him, maintaining a careful space between them. "You're right," he admitted, looking down at his hands in his lap. "About everything. I constructed a narrative where you were the problem, where your dedication to work was selfishness, where your excellence was somehow a judgment on my mediocrity. I needed to believe that because admitting the truth was too painful." "What truth?" Jonathan took a deep breath, forcing himself to say it aloud for the first time. "That I married someone extraordinary and spent our entire marriage trying to diminish you, because facing how ordinary I was in comparison seemed impossible. That I was afraid of your greatness because it exposed how small I had allowed myself to become." Charlotte remained silent for a long moment, watching the children playing near the fountain. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a deep sadness. "You know what's saddest, Jonathan? I never asked you to be extraordinary. I just wanted a partner who saw me, who was genuinely interested in my life, who celebrated my victories instead of treating them as inconveniences. That's not greatness. That's the basic foundation of a relationship." "I know that now," Jonathan said, feeling his throat tighten. "Seeing you at that gala, seeing how that entire ballroom responded to you, realizing I'd lived with you for 5 years and had no idea who you truly were. It was like waking from a dream and finding I'd slept through my own life." But you didn't sleep through your life, Jonathan. You actively chose not to pay attention. Every time I tried to share something important about my work, and you changed the subject. Every declined invitation to events that mattered to me. Every glazed-over look when I spoke about my passions. Those were choices, not accidents. The words hurt precisely because they were true. Jonathan couldn't hide behind excuses about being tired or distracted. He had chosen, repeatedly, to place himself at the center of his own universe and relegate Charlotte to a supporting role in his narrative. "How did you put up with it for so long?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Why didn't you end it years ago?" Charlotte gave a small, sad smile. "Because I kept hoping you'd finally see me. I kept thinking that if I was patient enough, if I gave you enough space, you would eventually wake up, and we'd realize we were losing each other. But you never woke up. Not until you were forced to." "And now it's too late," Jonathan said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement. "Yes," Charlotte confirmed softly. "It's too late for us. I don't hate you, Jonathan. I'm not even angry anymore. But I also can't go back to a relationship where I have to make myself smaller to make you feel bigger. I deserve more than that. I always did." "You deserve everything," Jonathan agreed, his voice cracking slightly. "And I'm so sorry it took me so long to realize. I'm sorry I wasted your years. I'm sorry I was too cowardly to face my own inadequacies without blaming you for them. And I'm especially sorry for Paris, for bringing Camille to that gala, for trying to humiliate you even without knowing you'd be there." Charlotte looked at him directly, and he saw something soften in her features. "You know what's strange? When I saw you two there, my first emotion wasn't anger. It was relief. Because finally I was allowed to leave without guilt, without wondering if I should have tried harder. You freed me, Jonathan, even if that wasn't your intention." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the garden's life continue around them. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old trees, bringing the scent of earth and approaching autumn. Somewhere nearby, a street artist played the accordion, the melancholic melody drifting through the air like a perfect soundtrack for that moment of closure. "What will you do now?" Charlotte finally asked. Jonathan shrugged. "I've lost my job. I don't have an apartment waiting in Boston. Honestly, I'm not really sure of anything except that I need to figure out how to be a better person before I try to build any kind of new life." Charlotte nodded slowly. "That's more self-awareness than you've shown in 5 years. It's a start." She paused, then added, "Daniel told me you refused any financial settlement in the divorce. I didn't marry you for money, and I'm not walking away from this accepting guilt payments. You built everything you have through hard work and talent. I contributed nothing but resentment and criticism. Still, you're legally entitled to—" "I don't want what I'm legally entitled to," Jonathan gently interrupted. "I want to start from scratch, without crutches, without shortcuts. Maybe for the first time in my life, I need to truly work for something I build." Charlotte studied his face for a long moment, looking for signs of manipulation or performative self-pity. Seemingly satisfied with what she saw, she nodded. "Then I sincerely wish you luck, Jonathan. I hope you find a way to become the man you could have been. Not for me, but for yourself, and for whoever enters your life in the future." Jonathan felt tears burning behind his eyes, but he forced them back. He had no right to cry, no right to make her comfort him through his own grief for the person he should have been. "I'll never stop regretting the time I wasted with you. I'll never stop wishing I could go back and be the partner you deserved." "But you can't go back," Charlotte said softly, standing up. "None of us can. All we can do is learn from our mistakes and try to do better next time." Jonathan also stood, keenly aware that this was his last chance to be in her presence, to absorb the details he had ignored for so long. The way she tilted her head when thoughtful, the slight frown between her eyebrows when she was processing something difficult, the grace in every movement, even in this moment of painful farewell. "Thank you," he said finally, "for giving me this conversation, for not hating me, for being gracious even when I didn't deserve grace." Charlotte put her sunglasses back on, creating that final barrier between them. "Take care, Jonathan, and the next time you find someone special, pay attention from the start. Don't wait until you lose her to finally see her." She turned to walk away, but Jonathan called her name one last time. When she looked back, he said the words he should have said 1,000 times over the 5 years. "You are extraordinary, Charlotte Whitmore. Paris was right to celebrate you. The whole world should celebrate you. And I was a blind fool who was lucky enough to be in your orbit, even if I wasn't smart enough to appreciate it." A small smile touched Charlotte's lips, genuine but sad. "Goodbye, Jonathan." And then she was walking away, her back straight and her head held high, disappearing down the gravel path among the old trees of the Jardin du Luxembourg. Jonathan watched until she was completely out of sight, imprinting that final image on his memory as both penance and a reminder. When he finally left the park, Paris continued its eternal life around him, indifferent to yet another broken heart on its ancient streets. But something had changed in him during that brief conversation. The fantasy had died completely, replaced by a harsh but necessary clarity about who he was and how much work he needed to do. Jonathan didn't know where he would go from here, what shape his life would take now that all the old structures had crumbled. But, for the first time in years, perhaps in his entire adult life, he was ready to do the difficult work of becoming someone who could look at his own reflection without shame. Charlotte deserved that version of him years ago. He couldn't give it to her now, but he could give it to himself and to anyone who entered his life in the future. It was the least he could do, and the only thing that truly mattered. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Jonathan left the garden behind, walking toward an uncertain, but finally, painfully honest future.